welcome you back to another important lecture. And for today, we would be discussing this important concept from this topic of the nervous coordination and response, and this is the reflex action, we say. Now, the scenario was that our nervous system has this brain and the spinal cord, and then we have got these sensory neurons, the relay neurons, and the motor neurons. So we must be very much clear about it. How come these neurons they would allow our body to be taking some action? So if I were to broadly categorize the actions of the body, so they fall into two major categories. On one side, the actions that the body perform, they are the involuntary actions, and the other actions that are accomplished by the body, so they are entitled as voluntary actions, we say. Now, wherever the word involuntary is coming, so you must know is that these actions they would be very fast, they would be automatic, and at any cost they would not involve the decision-making centers of the brain. And on the other way around, the voluntary actions that we have, so they are slow with us and they would not be automatic because we are controlling them by involving the decision-making power of the brain. Now, what do we mean by the decision making or no decision making power of the brain? So you see that there was this hot pan and you mistakenly touch it and you would remove your hand first and later you would realize that okay, fine, this pan was hot. So here you see that you done the action first and then your brain get to know of it later. So this is what we call that the involuntary action. They do not involve the decision making power. The action would be accomplished first and then the thought process would try to work later. But when we talk about the voluntary action, so we firstly use our decision making power of the brain. Like if I were to say that there is this book lying on the table, you just go it and pick it up. So now you would decide that whether you are required to be picking it up and bringing it to me or no. So when you involve the decision-making power of the brain, the actions would be voluntary and they are slow. Since the involuntary action, they do not involve the decision-making power of the brain, so they would be fast. Now, in these involuntary actions, we have to discuss these specific actions, and they are termed as the reflex action. And we say that these reflex actions, they are automatic, they are involuntary actions of the body, and they do not involve the decision making center of the brain. And whenever these reflex actions would be accomplished, so for sure there has to be the flow of the information in the form of an electrical impulse. So during the reflex action, the kind of the pathway that an electrical impulse follows, so this is what we refer to this as a reflex arc, we say. So if I were to quickly tell you that body has to do this reflex action, so how come the electrical impulse would flow? So initially there would be the stimulus we would be exposed to. From here the information would go to the receptors and then they would come to the sensory neuron, then the relay neuron, and then it would go to the motor neuron, and then ultimately they would end up at the muscles. And one of the major note that you have to take in this point is that these reflex actions they are entirely controlled by the spinal cord alone. The spinal cord would do the action first, the brain would be given the information, but the brain would be taking the thought process later after the action has been done. Now, since this is under the impact of the spinal cord, so here I would quickly take you to be understanding the structure of the spinal cord. This is not the requirement of your exam, but the identification of the neurons at this point is important. Now, you were to see that for the spinal cord, at the center of the spinal cord, we have this gray matter with us, like this looks like a butterfly like kind of a shape. And outside of this gray matter, the outer region of the spinal cord, now this would be formed by a matter, and that matter is referred to as the white matter, we say. And this spinal cord has got two roots getting out of it. Now, here you see this root that has got a bulge in it, so this would be referred to as the dorsal root. And likewise, the other arm of the spinal cord that does not has any of the bulge like this and appears to be a little bit of the smoother So this is the ventral root of the spinal cord. Now, if I were to be telling you in a way that here was this candle or there was this flame or some hot pan and you did not realize this was hot and you mistakenly touch it. So you see is that in your hand there would be these receptors, and these receptors, they would change the heat energy in this object to an electrical impulse, and this electrical impulse would now be conveyed to this neuron, and this neuron is a sensory neuron because the sensory neuron cell body is basically lying in this bulge of the spinal cord, and we call this as the dorsal root ganglion. Now, from the sensory neuron, the information is coming within the spinal cord. Now, here we have got this relay neuron with us, and this relay neuron would convey the information to this motor neuron, and the motor neuron you see has got its dendrites lying within the gray matter of the spinal cord, but the axon of the motor neuron, you see that this is leaving through the ventral root of the spinal cord, and then at the end, it would be conveying the information to the biceps muscles that you have in the arm, and the triceps muscles would be relaxed. And in this way, the hand would be removed away from the hot source. You would remove your hand first from the hot source, and your brain would realize it later that, okay, fine, this was some hot object. So, this is how the reflex section is being controlled by the spinal cord. Like, if I were to summarize it, here you have the receptor, now this is the sensory, now you have to follow the route. This is the relay neuron. From the relay neuron comes the motor neuron, and then it would terminate into the muscles of your body. Now, if I were to be telling you about the mechanism of this reflex action, so you see in the above example, the hand touched the hot object. This is the stimulus. Now, this is something you have to know in terms of when the examiner asks about the explanation. So you would say that there were the receptors in the hand and they have detected the stimulus and they converted it into the electrical impulse. The electrical impulse then got transmitted to the sensory neuron, and whose cell body, if you see, it was lying within the dorsal root ganglion. Now, the sensory neuron would convey the information to the relay neuron, and the usual thing with the relay neuron is that this is lying within the spinal cord. From the relay neuron, the information would go to the motor neuron, and the motor neuron would leave the spinal cord, and this motor neuron would cause the biceps muscles to contract and the tricep muscles of your arm to relax, and by that, your hand would be moved away from the hot source. Now, if I were to show you another diagram, so you see again we have got this spinal cord with us, and here you have got your toe, and mistakenly you touched it on some sharpened object, and here are the receptors. They would change the energy in the stimulus into electrical impulse. Now you follow the neuron, and this neuron has got the cell body out of the main structure. So this is a sensory neuron. The sensory neuron is entering the spinal cord through this dorsal root, and now this is conveying the information to the relay neuron, and where the relay neuron is lying within the spinal cord. From here, the information would be conveyed to the motor neuron, and you see that this motor neuron is eliminating or terminating in the muscle of your leg, and by that you would move your feet away from this sharpened object. So I hope you would be clear with the reflex section and how you would be able to identify these different neurons when the examiner would give you in it. So see you for the next class where we would be looking on toward the synapse and the synapses concept.